Let me just introduce this series. So welcome to The Torch of Progress. This is the speaker series for Progress Studies for Young Scholars. Progress Studies for Young Scholars is an online summer program in the history of technology aimed at high school students and up. And just before we dive in today, I want to let you know we do have events going on every week, and we've got some great speakers coming up. Next week, we are going to have Joel Mokyr, author of a number of books, including most recently A Culture of Growth. That will be next Wednesday, July 8th. After that, we've got Noor Siddiqui, a biotech founder of a company called Orchid Bioscience, and also a Teal Fellow. That will be Wednesday, July 15th. And after her, Anton Howes will be joining us to talk about his new book, Arts and Minds, A History of the Royal Society for Arts. And that will be on Wednesday, July 22nd. All of those events are at 10 a.m. Pacific time.
I served on Anton's PhD examination in London, and Joel Mokyr is one of my oldest friends.
Wonderful. They're both. Well, I know Anton a little bit personally, and he is a wonderful person, and I've been fascinated by Mokyr's books, so looking forward to that one as well. I am your host, Jason Crawford. I write The Roots of Progress, where I write about the history of technology and the philosophy of progress. I'm also the creator of this course, Progress Studies for Young Scholars. And our guest today, our speaker, is Professor Deirdre Nansen McCloskey. She is a professor emerita at University of Illinois at Chicago, has written more books and articles than I could possibly recount for you, including, I would say, most famously, a series of books known as the Bourgeois Era. And Siri thinks that I'm talking to her. No, a series of books known as the Bourgeois Era.
Funny.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, I'm glad to be here. As I said before, this is from the famous Grand Canyon of South Central Illinois. You may not know that there's a Grand Canyon there, but here it is.
All right. So we'll dive in. I've got some questions to start us off, and then we will take some questions from the audience for the last 20 minutes or so.
Certainly.
15 or 20 minutes. Our students have already learned about the Great Enrichment, as you call it, and I love that term. Probably most people here are familiar with the dramatic rise in living standards of the last couple hundred years. But can you just summarize for the audience your theory of these bourgeois ideals that led to it?
Well, the first thing to understand, and the most important takeaway, is how big the Great Enrichment is. It's something like 3,000% increase in national income. Not a doubling of national income per head, per person in real terms. Not a doubling, which is 100%, or even a tripling, which is 200%, but a factor of 30. Now that's to put it mildly, that's transformative. And it's happening in more and more countries. It's happening now at a rate which will eventually achieve it in China and India, 40% of the world's population. And the question is why? Now, the way economists usually approach this, and economic historians, is to talk about capital accumulation. Or if they're on the left politically, they talk about exploitation, slavery, and imperialism. None of those work. What works, they don't work at all. Accumulation, just by itself, you pile brick on brick or bachelor's degree on bachelor's degree, and you reach very quickly, if there's no innovation going on, diminishing returns. Suppose instead of having one automobile, you had 20 automobiles. Would that make you 20 times better off? No, it wouldn't. You just have all these cars in your front yard. And exploitation doesn't work either. You can steal from people if you want, but if you steal from poor people, as imperialism is, or as slavery is, you don't get very much. If you were to steal from the homeless people in your neighborhood, you wouldn't earn much. If you're going to steal from France. So accumulation and stealing, exploitation don't work. So what does work? What does work and did work is a change in the attitude towards the middle class and towards what the middle class does in the way of manufacturing and trading and above all, invention. Before the 18th century, innovation was a bad word in English and French and other languages. Because no, you don't want to innovate. That might disturb the hierarchy that's characteristic of old agricultural societies, where the aristocrats, the king, and priests are on top, and the milkmaid is at the bottom. But in the 18th century, people like Voltaire and the blessed Adam Smith and Mary Wollstonecraft and Tom Paine started saying, wait a minute, we can have a society in which there are no slaves, in which everyone's free. We can, as Tom Paine said, we can make the world anew by abolishing this hierarchy of higher and lower. Now, we haven't ever achieved that, as you see in the, right now in the Black Lives Matter problem, agitation. I mean, it's completely justified in my view. But we improved it a lot. More and more people were allowed, as the English say, to have a go, to try out stuff. And the result was an astounding increase in invention, especially after around 1800. It got more and more crazy. More and more things were invented. Electric lights and automobiles and airplanes and institutional changes like containerization in shipping. And the result was this extraordinary increase. Now, of course, if the extraordinary increase had gone only to the rich, I would be joining my friends on the left on the picket line. Overthrow this stuff, this is terrible. But that's not true, that's not what happened. The poor were the chief beneficiaries. The poor are your ancestors and mine. Mine were unspeakably poor Irish and Norwegian peasants. Yours were whatever they were. But in 1800, the average person on the planet was earning in modern prices $2 or $3 a day. Imagine trying to get along in San Francisco or York or London or wherever on $2 or $3 a day. Now, in these places, it's over $100 a day. So it was caused, in brief, in one sentence, the Great Enrichment was caused by making people free. And that, you know, there's nothing novel or new, or McCloskey's so clever, she thought this up, and all the other economists are wrong. It's actually the theory that these 18th century liberals, Voltaire and Smith and so forth, that's what they thought. They didn't realize it would have such an enormous payoff, but they thought this would be a much better society, and it certainly is.
Yeah. So you said making people free. Now, in your book, Bourgeois Dignity, you say it wasn't property rights, not even really patents. It wasn't institutions like being able to create corporations. So what type of freedom was it? Can you elaborate or make that more specific?
It was the freedom to do what you want, maybe start a corporation if you want, or not have a patent. See, the problem with patents is that they're government-sponsored monopolies. It should worry people that patents and copyrights were invented by the Venetians 5 centuries ago. And the Venetians were famous for enforcing monopolies on their tricks in blowing glass or whatever, or their trade to the Eastern Mediterranean. So a patent is not where it's at. Whereas, as by the way, ask your guest next week, Joe Mokyr, about patents, and he'll tell you, no, patents weren't it. And so you're free up to the point of someone else's nose to try out things. Now that means you have to have comprehensive freedom of employment. You have to allow people into occupations. It's quite shocking how in the United States in the last 50 years, occupational licensing has increased. In 1950, 5% of occupations involved a state license. Now it's 30%. And that's a real obstacle to poor people earning a living by braiding hair or doing interior decoration. So it turns out that not having the right to exploit other people, as the hierarchy, the agricultural hierarchy did, not having slaves, I think that's the simplest way to put it. Another way to put it is this liberalism I talk about, it, not the way Americans talk about it these days, but the way other people do, other people in the world do. Liberalism is the theory that people should be allowed to be adults, that adult people are not children, to be either, I don't know, helped out with quotation marks around it, but supervised, or dominated, but supervised, and that's the left and the right's view of poor people, but allowed to not to do what they want. That's like the people who say, oh, I don't have to wear a mask for COVID-19 because I'm a free person, I can do what I want. No, you can't go around punching people in the nose or infecting people in the nose. But within a very broad area, what was novel is this freedom from guilds, from government-sponsored monopolies of various kinds, from coercion by your lord. It was commonplace in the 1700s and before.
How were the guilds dissolved?
The guilds were dissolved. They were weak in Holland and England, which is quite interesting, because it's in Holland and England that the modern world began. But they were strong in France and Germany and Italy. And they were abolished, actually, in those countries by the French Revolution, most particularly by Napoleon's armies. When they came into Germany or Italy, the first thing they did was abolish all such privileges.
Wow.
So now we've reformed the guilds. And after all, doctors, for example, in the United States, are very heavily protected by the government. You can't practice medicine in the United States unless you've got a American medical degree and you've served your internship and blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
And
occupational licensing as a modern guild system.
Occupational licensure is modern guilds.
Yeah, wow. Now, you mentioned Holland, so it seems that they were ahead of Britain in some way in this Great Enrichment, and then somehow they kind of lost it, or so what happened there? How did that pass from Holland to England?
It happened the way it's happening here in the modern world. The monopolies, the guilds, reasserted their powers. Not so much guilds in the Dutch case, but the regents, so-called, the regenten in Dutch, wanted nice tight little monopolies, and so they enforced it in the 18th century. Whereas in the 16th and 17th century, what we now call Holland or the Dutch were very free market, and were able to do extremely well while fighting with one hand a revolt against Spain, against the King of Spain. They were prospering and inventing inventing in many things. They invented the microscope, the telescope, the clock, the pendulum clock, and improved science, and blah, 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 in the 17th century. But then they kind of lost their mojo in the 18th, and it was countries like what became the United States and England and Scotland who took over the lead. Yet still by 1800, the two richest countries in the world per capita were Holland and Britain.
Yeah. So you make this case that bourgeois liberty and dignity are necessary for enrichment. Do you think they are?
No, it's more. They're not just necessary. There are an infinite number of things that are necessary for economic growth or anything else. The existence of the universe is necessary. The existence of liquid water at normal temperatures is necessary. Rule of law is necessary. Investment market is necessary. They're all necessary. But what I'm looking for, and what I think any scientist of these matters should be looking for, is sufficiency. Is something that acts as the spring in the mechanical clock of the modern world. The gears are necessary. Yeah, it's nice, good. You have to have them. I'm not against them. But they're commonplace. They happened essentially at all times and in places for millennia, yet didn't result in the Great Enrichment until the 18th and 19th century. What was the secret sauce? What was the sufficiency? And the sufficiency was liberty.
And now what about the relationship of science? It seems that science, technology, they were needed for these inventions. There was a whole scientific revolution.
Yeah. Well, ask Joel about that next week.
I will.
He'll tell you all about it. He and I have a lot in common. We agree on a great many things. We form with a few other people a very small ideational school of economic history, where Joel says and I say, and a few others say, ideas are where the modern world came from. Not investment, not slavery, but ideas. And Joel thinks that the idea of science was crucial. And good Lord knows I'm not against science. But what we don't agree on is the timing. Joel thinks that it matters very early. He says, if they didn't know the weight of air, they couldn't have had an atmospheric steam engine. Well, I don't know. People were fooling around with what amounted to atmospheric steam engines in the ancient world. So wait a second, I don't know if you need this theory. But anyway, I would agree with him that after around 1900, science really starts to matter. Artificial fertilizers, for example, are terribly important. The Green Revolution, to take another similar case, made India into a net grain exporter in really a very few years, in about 10 years. So science matters a lot. We couldn't have what we're on right now without science, I agree. But before that, it's mainly technology. And the problem is that people put it all into one word, and they say it fast. They say science and technology. So that you get the idea that science is really what it is, and technology is just what these silly bourgeoisie do and making it pay off. And that's not right. Everything around you, look around your house, pardon me, is designed. There's a designer behind every manufactured item in your house. And it's designed for beauty and for profit. And everything you see around you is. And that has very little to do with science on the whole. So science is nice. I'm not an anti-science person. I regard myself as a scientist. But It's the craftsperson, the engineer applying the science. This is why I'm against this passion for STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
So was it just a coincidence that the scientific revolution and this sort of bourgeois revaluation happened in the same place and era?
It's not. I've sort of refined the idea of the bourgeois revaluation to focus on the liberalism. And without a free society in which to exercise it, science would not have worked. It, you can make the claim that, oh, well, you can centralize science. That was Francis Bacon's idea. And it's a lousy idea. It doesn't ever work very well. On the contrary, science with what Karl Polanyi's smarter brother, Michael Polanyi, said, science works best in a liberal society. And even inside science itself, things work best if you don't have hierarchies and coercion. Mayanists, of all people, were prevented for 30 years from deciphering glyphs on Mayan monuments because the chief Mayanist in the world was a professor at Harvard who didn't believe they constituted any kind of writing. He thought they were just ornaments. And when that kind of hierarchy is operating in science, science stops.
In that context,
so in other words, I'm saying liberalism, a free society, which resulted in ingenuity, also results in scientific ingenuity. Galileo was stopped by hierarchy.
Yeah. In that context, what do you think of the way that it seems that the way we fund science today, we have begun centralizing it under the NIH provides most funding for health science today. It's $40 billion. It seems to me there's some sort of a centralizing effect there.
Absolutely.
Thoughts on that?
We've been doing that ever since the war. And it's because of our wonderful success with the Manhattan Project. People are always going back to the Manhattan Project to justify centralization. But look what's happening on the engineering side to spaceflight. Spaceflight is becoming commercial. And you say, oh, well, that took NASA. NASA had to come first or we wouldn't have gotten spaceflight. Well, I don't think that's true. I think once we realize that geo-stable position satellites could do all the things they do, commerce would have done it. And in any case, of course, the advantage in the United States, actually, I must say, I've taught in other academic systems, such as Holland and Sweden. And our system has the advantage that there are all these crazy variety of American colleges and universities and independent scholars by the ton and institutes and this, that, and the other thing, all sort of competing with each other. And that makes for a healthier scientific environment, again, following Michael Polanyi, than does the bureau model, which is what the Europeans like. They want CERN to be where you do research, and they want up and down. In Holland, every academic has virtually a number stamped on her head of her ranking in her field.
Moving on a little bit, what is the relationship of the bourgeois ideals that you identify to the Enlightenment?
It's not the bourgeois ideals. People are always getting this wrong. Even Joel gets it wrong from time to time. And it's just crazy because I keep saying it's not that the bourgeoisie changed in behavior. It's not that they suddenly got virtuous or anyway somehow changed. Now that's Max Weber. That's a psychological change that he claimed in 1905, which is false. It's been shown every which way to be false. The theology is wrong, the economic history is wrong, the economics is crazy, everything's wrong about it. So that's not it. It's not that suddenly people got clever. It's that the rest of the society stopped hating them. In Shakespeare, who was the son of a glover, bourgeois, lower bourgeois craftsman, and was himself bourgeois, ran theaters. That's how he earned his income, was writing, not writing his plays, someone else could do that maybe, but by running the theaters. Has no bourgeois hero in the whole of his plays. You say, oh, well, The Merchant of Venice. Antonio in The Merchant of Venice is a fool for love. Love for the aristocrat. Love for the aristocrat. Bassanio. And Shylock is certainly not an admired figure. So, and nowhere else in Shakespeare is any middle-class person, any inventor, any commercial person elevated. They're all liars and thieves. So that changes. As I show, in, especially in my third volume, Bourgeois Equality, I have a lot of evidence about this change in attitude towards the middle class, towards inventors, and what they called in Britain, they called them projectors. A perfect example of this is our own Benjamin Franklin, who wants to be a gentleman all his life. He's the son of a candle maker. He's an apprentice printer. And this is working class stuff. Yet through enterprise, through invention, he raises himself up. And that's what you get from the change in attitude. Franklin himself is part of the change in attitude. His example is part of the change in attitude. Most of the people who made the Constitution thought of themselves as kind of aristocrats.
And so this shift in these attitudes, does this have any relation to the broader phenomenon of the Enlightenment?
Well,
how would you fit those together?
Sort of. I mean, the Enlightenment would have not resulted to anything. It wouldn't have mattered very much if it had continued to be the province of aristocrats. That's what it was. It was the soirees in French aristocratic households were the locus of the French environment, in Enlightenment. Now, there were exceptions to this, Bale and so forth, but I'm talking about the bulk of what was going on in the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Now, in Scotland, it wasn't the same. So if I was to talk about the Enlightenment, I would talk not about the rational Enlightenment of France, where reason is the god, but the practical and the liberal Enlightenment in Scotland. Adam Smith, the blessed Adam Smith, I always cross myself, was an egalitarian. But he was an egalitarian of permission, not as Rousseau claimed to be, although he wasn't actually, but he claimed to be an egalitarian of outcome. And those two, either giving people permission to have a go, on the one hand, that's Scottish, or giving people the same income in the end state egalitarianism, which is Rousseau. Those are the two roots of the two great competing politics of Europe. Liberalism on the one hand, socialism on the other.
Yeah. Are there any risks or downsides to the bourgeois virtues? What should we be careful to complement them with, if anything?
Again, you're talking about the bourgeois virtues as though that was my point. Now, I understand, I don't want to get mad at you, but understand that the first book was mistitled. I called it The Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. Now, what I did in the book was to point out that commercial virtues are just commercial versions of the 7 traditional virtues in the West. You can find parallels in South Asia and Confucian thought and so forth. It's not that people got better. It's not that they got virtues they didn't have before. The middle class, the merchants and so on have always had the virtue of prudence, balanced with the virtues of love and justice and hope and faith and courage and temperance. That was the theme of the book, that they've always had it. So having discovered that, so to speak, I then realized that the question was the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And for that, I realized slowly, it came in the second book called Bourgeois Dignity, and then especially in the third called Bourgeois Equality, I realized that there had been a radical change in some countries and not in others. In England, and especially in Scotland and in the North American colonies of England, in the attitude towards the commercial versions of the virtues. So it's not that the virtues flourished. It's not that the people of the modern country club are better, as Donald Trump thinks they are, than the people who don't belong to a country club. Those poor losers, Donald would say. No. On the contrary, the key idea is equality. As the great African-American poet of the 1930s, whose name is escaping me, said, "Oh, let America be America again. The nation that has not yet been, or the land that has not yet been, the land where every man is free, and every woman dear too." That's the basic idea, that no slaves, no hierarchies. You can't boss me around unless I want you to, unless I make a deal with you. It's the exercise of violence, physical violence, that makes for these hierarchies. And that's what the liberals, such as Walt Whitman, for example, were against. And Henry David Thoreau, who, by the way, ran for a while his father's pencil factory and improved it to the point where Thoreau and Son made the best pencils in America.
Wow. Did not know that.
No, people think he was a socialist. He wasn't at all.
So what does your theory imply for policy or culture today? What should we do to continue to drive progress and enrichment?
Nothing. Briefly.
Elaborate?
My former...
Surely you're not saying it's just going to happen on its own.
Yeah, it is going to happen on its own if the government doesn't adopt industrial policy, doesn't adopt protection in international trade, such as the protection of American drug manufacturers so that we can't buy drugs from Canada. This is crazy. That's what the government specializes in. Special deals for this interest or that. No, leave people alone. enforce the laws, although most of them are enforced privately anyway, and go to it. It's that element. It's the aspect, or that's not the exact word. That's the portion of modern politics and sociology since the 18th century. It's that free portion that's done most of the work. So, I mean, honestly, get rid of eminent domain, for example, which is an outrageous intrusion on freedom. Get rid of, what's it called? When you seize someone's house because there are drugs in it.
So the civil asset forfeiture.
Yes, civil asset forfeiture. Get rid of all the rules on occupational licenses. Look, we economists at least are consistent about this. There is no government license you need to claim that you're an economist. One of the current advisors to the president, Larry, what's his name, is not an economist, yet he's advising Trump on economics. Embarrassingly, one of his others, Peter Navarro, like me, has a PhD in economics from Harvard. How this guy got it, I have no idea. And I'm organizing a group of Harvard PhDs in economics to turn in their PhDs because Peter Navarro has one. So get rid of all the protections which end up hurting the poor and women and Black people. After all, it's the government that enforced Jim Crow. It's the government that enforced redlining for mortgages. These are government programs, so to speak.
And what about at the level of culture? Do we need to, have we lost some of that respect for business and inventors, and do we need to bring that back?
We need to bring that back. Now look, I'm not saying we should worship Steve Jobs. The guy was a terrible jerk. But on the other hand, he knew how to make things that people wanted to buy. Who's that? Is that Steve? Is that, no, that's his, that's Steve Jobs. Yeah, that's Steve Jobs and all the other, there he is in the corner. And more than in most other, certainly much more than in Europe. As I said, I've lived and taught in Britain, Holland, and Sweden. And there, especially in Sweden, of course, but also in Holland, there's much less respect for innovators, for people who risk everything for their ideas than there is in the United States. So we have an advantage there, but we keep falling back into wanting to protect the poor by hurting them. And this is commonplace. I mean, the indignation over Uber, for example. Uber breaks down the taxi monopoly. And it's good for poor people because Uber drivers will go into the south side or west side of Chicago to get fares, whereas the standard cab drivers will not. And yet the left, my friends on the left, and I was once a Marxist myself, my friends on the left will say, oh, Uber is terrible. I don't know what they think. It's a monopoly or I don't know. They don't understand entry. That's one of their basic problems. And if the government doesn't prevent entry, people can have a go.
You mentioned you were once a Marxist. You've had quite a personal sort of intellectual journey. What are some of the biggest things you've changed your mind about and why?
Well, a lot of things. I mean, I still want to help the poor. That's how I became I was a Kropotkinite anarchist for a while when I was about 15. Then I was a kind of Joan Baez socialist for a couple of years. I played the guitar and sang labor songs. I know more labor songs than all of my left-wing colleagues. We had we started a faculty union at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And and we had, at one time, we had a picket line, and I was teaching my left-wing friends the songs of the labor movement. So I was that for a while. Then I started studying economics at Harvard, and all that was Harvard College. All that was on offer was Keynesianism, so I became a Keynesian. Then I became a kind of social engineer. I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. That was my attitude. And then I started to study economic history and gradually realized that economics could be used to understand human, as I much later learned to call them, spontaneous orders. And my first job was at the University of Chicago. I had tenure there. And so I gradually became a Chicago School economist. And then then I started studying the humanities in the 1980s quite seriously. I became a professor of English at UIC eventually. I'm a proud graduate of the Summer School of Criticism and Theory. And so I started to see economics in a broader way. And I got interested in Austrian economics because of some personal contacts with Austrians. And then so I've been everything. I've been everything except a conservative. I'm often accused of being a conservative, but it's ridiculous. I'm a radical. And I want the society to change, and I want it to change in the direction of freedom.
Yeah.
So now I call it humanomics. In fact, I was working this morning on a book. I've actually got 2 books which the University of Chicago is going to publish next year on against neo-institutionalism and other behaviorist theories that economists have, and in favor of what I call humanomics. Economics with the humans left in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we will go to audience questions in just a minute. So anybody who's got a question, if you are in the class, you can ask it in our private Slack. Look in the announcements channel for the thread. We prioritize questions from our students in the course. Everybody else, go ahead and put your question in the Slack chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can.
I'll try to be briefer than I have. I was trying to exposit the whole. By now I've written about, I don't know how many books on this subject. I've written quite a few books on this subject, half a dozen, one way or another, books like this on these matters.
Yes, and they're not short books.
No, well, once I knew how to write short books, and then they invented word processing. Now I can't control myself. I write 500 pages. I mean, Jesus, shut up, Deirdre.
All right. So last question before we go to some student and audience questions. What advice, and this is especially for our high schoolers in the audience, what advice that's commonly given to teenagers do you think is actually wrong? And what would you replace it with?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I've never thought of it. It's commonly wrong. Well, let's see now. That's really quite a puzzling and interesting question. I mean, I got a lot of wrong advice in my time. For example, let's help the poor by governing them. That's what's often said. We can't just give them money. Or still better, give them permission to become doctors if they want, or become lawyers. Abraham Lincoln never went to law school, and yet I understand he was a pretty good lawyer. So I don't know. It's a puzzling question you're asking, right?
On a personal level, is there anything you remember that somebody, people told you advice that you shouldn't have taken or glad you didn't take?
Well, there's one that I'm very old. I'm 77 years old, so do the math. I grew up in the 1950s. And in the United States and in Northern Europe generally in the 1950s, we were told, don't be queer. don't be homosexual. Say, I'm not, I was never, and I'm not now, but I'm transgendered. I was once a guy. So maybe you can tell, as you can tell from my voice. And I was told, oh no, that's terrible. Well, don't do that, don't do that. And that, I wish that hadn't happened, not to me so much. I didn't suffer much from it, but it was a reign of terror for about 100 years. And very strangely, not in Latin America on the whole, not in the Mediterranean countries, but especially in Germany, Holland, the United States, Britain, Australia.
Yeah.
So if you're queer, you're here, they should get used to it. Don't worry about it.
All right. Good note to let's move to some questions from we're going to go first from our students and instructors. So Fergus asks, what about East Asia? Wasn't that development a result of government interference in the economy, even if they just encouraged exports?
No, I mean the sort of classic example is South Korea. And export-led growth is a long tradition in economics, but I've written tons against it, both historically in the 19th century and in contemporary terms. No, the way you get rich is not kind of Keynesian. It's not aggregate demand from exports that have multiplier effects and put people to work. That's not how it works. What happens is that you think of new ways of doing things. And that's what South Korea, in fact, did. That's how they got rich. Here's an interesting one. The South Korean tiger moms, who are notorious, forced their kids to learn English. So that's right, exactly. Young people in South Korea now know English better than the Japanese do. Actually, much better than the Japanese. And that's the idea. Learn something, do something, open Samsung. That's how they got rich, not through aggregate demand puffing up the economy, which is the basic theory of export-led growth. I can't hear you.
There we go. Julia asks, do you think the widespread focus of educating towards the standardized tests, such as SAT and ACT, is harming progress because it inhibits diversity of thought?
Yeah, probably. Probably, although, how else is a kid, a really smart kid from some terrible high school, going to get out of it, out of being shunted off to the side, except by these standardized tests? So I don't have any sophisticated opinion about this. I'm not knowledgeable about them. Turns out I'm very good at taking such tests, because as a child and to some degree now, I stuttered very badly. And so this is 1950s now we're talking about. So I was constantly going to therapists, and they would always give me an IQ test. So I learned how to take them.
Okay, a question from Long. What do you think about Sweden as an economy and a society? They encompass respect for innovation and entrepreneurship, and also a strong social safety net. Is that a sweet spot for the economy, or is it possible only in a highly homogenous society?
I think it's a sweet spot, but as the question suggests, it's very hard to do in a country like the United States, which is big and kind of layered. And as we've seen in this ridiculous business about not wearing a face mask as a political statement, I mean, this is idiotic. In East Asia, they've always worn face masks. If you have a cold, people feel a responsibility to wear a face mask. Why the hell not? So it's very hard to get that going. But understand, as the questioner also said, seems to be very well informed, Sweden is a capitalist country. Now, I would prefer to use the word innovistic. It's an example not of capitalism, but of innovism. The word capitalism is extremely misleading, but it doesn't admire inherited wealth greatly. It does admire entrepreneurship. The ball bearing is a Swedish invention. The screw propeller on ships is a Swedish invention. I think the bandsaw, but I'm not sure about this, is a Swedish invention, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, but you know, people forget that the United States really does have a pretty good safety net. The Swedish one is more generous, but it's not as if there's a conviction among Swedes and Dutch people and so on that the United States has no safety net, and if you are unemployed, you're just completely bereft and you starve to death. That isn't, as you know, that's not the case. So the contrast that people are always drawing between Sweden and the United States is not really as great as people say. In Minnesota, it's like being in Sweden.
All right, we're going to keep taking questions for about 10 more minutes. Then we will say goodbye to our speaker, but Matt Bateman is going to stay on the line if anybody has questions about the high school course itself, or just wants to sort of continue the conversation. But if you have any questions about progress studies for young scholars in particular, Matt Bateman will take those at the end of the hour. All right, moving on. Another question from Long. What do you think about the New Deal? Net good or net bad for American economy?
Net bad for income. The Great Depression in the United States was much longer than it was in most other countries. In fact, to tell the truth, in all other countries, Canada, for example, or France, even France, but France was probably the worst. England, Germany, and so forth. There were lots of policy. What FDR did, actually I had a debate with my mother about this. She was born in 1922 and is a big FDR fan. And she said to me, FDR prevented the United States from slipping into fascism. And I said, yeah, by trying it out. And a lot of the programs of the New Deal were not as sweet as we remember them.
Sam asks, how important is immigration to innovation? What do you think about the problem of brain drain?
I don't think there's a problem of brain drain for the United States. It's the other way around. It's Mexico and India and so forth that suffer a brain drain because the United States is a better place for them to be. But to look at it from our point of view, immigration is essential. And it's just maddening that there are so many people now in charge in the White House. This fellow Miller, for example, is shocking. I mean, Donald Trump's grandfather was from Germany. His mother was from Scotland, and yet he's against immigration. What's going on here? Use a little common sense. Immigration is good for the country, not in aggregate demand terms, not in this Keynesian way, but because just as the questioner is suggesting, these people are often the innovators. I mean, they are, for example, in academic life. Notice on TV, when you get a doctor or a scientist, how often they have a foreign accent, usually a European accent, or they're clearly of South Asian descent. Now that's interesting.
Yeah, and in the technical world, my previous career, by the way, was in software and technology, and it's very clear how many, there's a lot of Indian CEOs and founders and all sorts of, I think more than half are immigrants of some type.
Exactly, if you want a dynamic society, let, as I said, let people free.
Yep. A question, audience question from Edward. He says, I see a need to think about strategies to change over time, values and so forth in the culture, as think tanks have tried to change public policies. Do you see that need? And do you have any suggestions on strategy?
Well, that's a very deep and troublesome question. I mean, if I was so smart, why aren't I rich? That is, why haven't I been able, or anyone else who has opinions like I do, able to change people's mind? My friend Don Boudreau, who runs Cafe Hayek, is a brilliant economist at George Mason University. And Don endlessly and with incredible patience tries to get protectionists to understand that international trade protectionism is idiotic. But I don't know, he doesn't have any effect on them. They keep coming back. They're like the waves of Chinese soldiers in the Korean War. They just keep coming. So look, we haven't got any government tricks we can do. I don't want it to go that way, and I wouldn't want to, even if I could, even if I was the czarina of the economy. But we can keep saying to people, do you want to be an adult? Do you want to be a non-slave? Why don't you want everyone to be a non-slave and an adult?
Question from Michael. What do you make of Leopold Kohr's theory of size in today's context? And maybe, I don't know what Leopold Kohr's theory of size is, so maybe you could explain that.
I don't either, but I don't know what he means by size. Maybe he means size of the economy. I'm not quite sure.
All right.
There's an awful lot of foolishness about scale. People get all, it was one of the big mistakes in the Soviet Union to think that there are always economies of scale. So if you have a tractor factory, it's got to be 3 miles long and make all the tractors in the USSR in this one factory. And that's a very naive view. Smallness sometimes is beautiful. As we were saying about science, it's not obvious that centralized big science is the way to go.
Mm-hmm. Question from one of our students, Binyamin. You mentioned that mechanical development came first and then scientific conclusions from that. But now it seems that most mechanical development is made on a basis of scientific support. Is this still how it should be, or should we be thinking more in mechanical terms and looking at mechanical success?
Actual innovation in machinery and in even biology, but especially machinery, has often nothing to do with science. It has to do with technology. It has to do with craft traditions in, say, mechanical engineering. When you make an assembly line, make it work. They have all the machines putting things in bottles and so on. That's got bugger all to do with science. I agree with Joel Mokyr to the extent that more and more in the modern world, science is the origin of technology. But it's still, I've tried to get Joel to join me in an empirical inquiry into this, where we look at what we use, the goods and services we use in the modern world, and try to calculate what percentage of their origin comes from just some mechanic fiddling around thinking, let's see, if I put it this way, it'll work that way. Or designers, as I keep saying, as against high scientists doing microbiology, thank God right now. But he won't do it. And I'd ask you to ask him about it next
All
week.
right. Well, we've got him next week, so we can ask him about that. One last and hopefully a brief question, and then we'll say goodbye. From Patrick, what are the best things to read about the Dutch Enlightenment?
Well, my own books. Every author says that.
Which one or two? The Bourgeois?
Well, the one that talks the most about Holland is the third volume called
Bourgeois Equality.
And there's a section about the Dutch. But no, there's a lot to learn about the Dutch Enlightenment. That's a good phrase. It's not normally used. The Dutch Enlightenment of the 17th century. It's quite extraordinary. The old book, The Embarrassment of Riches, is fun, but the trouble is he's an art historian, not an economic historian. There's a quite good book called The First Modern Economy by Jan de Vries, spelled in the Dutch way, and someone else. And that's quite good, although by now it's kind of old. Ik hou van Holland, which means I love Holland. I've lived there for 3 years and failed to learn Dutch, but tried.
All right. Well, we are at the bottom of the hour, so I think we're going to have to end it here. Unfortunately, this has been really wonderful. Thank you, Professor McCloskey, for coming on and sharing your thoughts and wisdom with us.
I enjoyed it. Hasta la vista.
And Matt, would you like to come up and take the stage?
Okay, dears, be good. If you can't be good, be careful.